How can you tell how big the stars are? When you look up at night and survey the stars, you can see variation in color and brightness, but that doesn't tell you anything about the size of the stars that are there because we don't know the distance to them. So in this video, what we're going to talk about are ways to figure out the size of the stars, namely using binary star systems. Now first, what are most stars like? What are the basic characteristics of stars? Well, all stars have nuclear fusion in their cores. We talked about this with the sun. The sun is constantly converting hydrogen into helium, and that is how it produces its light energy. So all stars will have this process taking place in their cores. But that still leaves a large range in properties. From size to temperature to luminosity, there's really a large range in what a star can be. Now, for the most part, stars are small and cool and dim. And when we say these terms, think in comparison to the sun. So most stars are smaller than the sun, cooler than the sun, more dim than the sun. The large, hot, and bright stars are the relatively rare ones. They just seem more common because their brightness makes them more apparent in our night sky. So you'll explore this a little bit further when you do the lab this week, where you actually plot out the stars that are nearest to us and look at their properties, and the stars that are brightest and look at their properties. And then in the comparison between those two groups, you can see that the small, cool, dim stars are much more common. The large, hot, bright stars are less so, but they are the brightest stars in our night sky. Now, the key fact about stars that will be important for this video is that most stars are part of multiple star systems, meaning that they're in orbit around one another. In particular, we're going to think about binary systems where you have two stars orbiting around one another. About half of all stars are in binary systems. Now, in a binary star system, or really any system where you have two objects in orbit around one another, there's a point in between them that we would call the center of mass. And you can think of that as the balance point. So that's what this diagram is illustrating. If you think of this line here as like a board, and this is a fulcrum that it's balanced on, a high mass star would be closer to the center of mass than the low mass star would be. Or you could think of these as rocks, anything that has mass. The center of mass between two objects is going to be closer to the higher mass stars. Now, the significance of that point, the center of mass, is that when they're in orbit, when two stars, a binary system, is in orbit, they orbit around the center of mass. This is also true for planets going around the sun. So the sun and any given planet you can think of as like a binary pair. The sun is so massive that the center of mass is basically located at the center of the sun. Although the sun is orbiting around, it is wobbling a little bit in its place in space due to the pull of the planets as well. But with binary star systems, we see a much more notable shift of the center of mass. And so both stars appear to be in orbit. You can physically see it. And the significance of the orbit is that, like we did in the Jupiter lab, we can use orbits to weigh the things that are in orbit using the laws of gravity. So there are different types of binary systems, and these are types based on how we're able to observe them. So they're all, a binary system is just two stars in orbit around one another, but the types that we'll distinguish are different ways that we see them. And the first type is called a visual binary, and as the name implies, they're visible. We can literally see both stars. So in the picture here, you can clearly distinguish two stars. And over time, so this is April of 2000, and then going forward in time, you can see the positions relative to one another changing. The stars are actually orbiting around one another. So in a visual binary, we can watch the orbit happen. And by timing the orbit, how long it takes to go around, that gives us a way to estimate the masses involved. Now for other stars, binary systems, they're either so far away or the alignment isn't such that we can see the two stars independently, but we can see the fact that they are a binary system through the Doppler effect by looking at the light spectrum. And these are called spectroscopic binaries. A telescope can't resolve both stars, but we can infer that there are two stars there from the Doppler shift in their spectral lines. So let's take a look at these diagrams here. They overlap at points 2 and 4, shifted at points 1 and 3. So let's look at these 4 different diagrams. So in diagram 1, A is coming towards you, B is going away from you. So the line for A is shifted to the left. It's blue shifted because it's coming towards you. B is going away, so it's red shifted. Now when they're moving perpendicular to your line of sight, then they're not Doppler shifted, and so the lines are together. And then in 3, when B has come over to this side, its line gets moved over here, and A's line gets moved to the right. A is now red shifted, B is blue shifted. And then diagram 4, B is at the bottom, A is at the top. Again, they're perpendicular, so there's no Doppler shift. So if you have a system like this and you take a look at its spectra over time, what you'll see is the spectral lines shifting or drifting one way or the other. So if you just look at what happens to the spectral line for A, it's into the green, then it moves back to yellow, it goes deeper into yellow, and then it moves back to green. And if you kept going forward, it would go back to green and so on. This would be a cycle. And that shifting back and forth would tell you that it is coming towards you and then moving away from you, and that signifies an orbit. You can look at the plot of its radial velocity in order to figure out the period, and then, again, as with the visual binary, from the period determine how massive the stars have to be. Now the third and final one type of binary system that we'll think about are eclipsing binaries. And in this case, the alignment is very special. Their alignment relative to us is very special in that we are in the direct line that is the plane of their orbit. So what we can see, so this is sort of like what we have for Jupiter and the other planets. All of the planets are in roughly the same plane of orbit. And so their moons eclipse in front of them. So if we're watching Jupiter, we can see the moons pass in front of Jupiter. For some binary systems, we have this same alignment. They're eclipsing binaries because one of the stars will pass in front of the other, eclipsing it. And then when we watch it, we can see the brightness of the star system dim because some of the light from one of the stars is being blocked during the eclipse. So if you record the light coming from a star over time, its brightness will be over here, and then it will drop down, reach some minimum level while the star is completely in front of the one star is completely in front of the other, and then it will ramp back up and go back to normal. So the dip here will tell us the orbit. So we can take time, how long does it take for one dip to happen? That's one star passing in front of the other. And then the opposite, the other star passes in front of the first one. And we get another dip. And so you can take the time between these successive dips to figure out the period of the orbit and, again, determine the mass. But another thing we can do here is look at this ramping up time, because this ramping up time has to do with how long it takes for the star to start eclipsing and then completely be eclipsed. And so this is a way of estimating the radius of the star, because essentially the distance that it is moving across the surface of the star is going to affect how much time it takes to ramp up here. If the star has a much bigger diameter, then it'll take more time to ramp up. And then it moves across for a period of time, and then it ramps up again. And so using the lengths of time here and the overall period, we can extract information about the relative diameter or radius of the two stars as well. So binary star systems, just in summary, are very, very useful. By studying the periods and using the laws of gravity, we can weigh the stars so we can have some idea of how massive these stars are. And then in this case here, we can also determine something about their radius, at least relative to one another. We can see about how many times bigger one star is than the other. And so these are properties that would otherwise be impossible to figure out. But in these binary systems, and luckily there are a lot of binary systems, we can start to put together the pieces of the puzzle about how much mass stars have, and then start thinking about the ranges in masses of stars.